Welcome to the Women Leading on Climate podcast. I'm Catherine McKenna. Well, it's really easy to feel overwhelmed by climate headlines right now. Honest, sometimes I do. But it's important to remember that real progress is happening and women are often leading it. In this podcast, I talk to women around the world who are leading on climate. And today, I am super happy to be talking to Catherine Abreu. Catherine is an internationally recognized award-winning climate campaigner and a Canadian policy expert. She's also the director of the International Climate Politics Hub, and to be honest, she's just generally awesome. And Kat's here to share her thoughts about the recent COP in Brazil, her ideas for next steps, especially next year, and the opportunities on climate that she is most excited about now. Kat, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. And the feeling of awesomeness is mutual.
Well, you know what, Kat, you always give me a bit of a pickup. I think this is a tricky time, and you must be exhausted. Are you exhausted? You just got back from Brazil?
I'm pretty exhausted. Yeah, COP was extra long this year. There were so many events that happened in the week prior that COP was like a 3-week long affair. I was in Brazil for a full month. So I'm finally back in Ottawa with the snow, but I'm feeling quite tired. And I have a bit of a cough, so listeners might hear that in my voice, but I'm doing all right.
All right. Everyone's sending you get well wishes.
Oh, thanks.
So maybe, more broadly, it's a tough time on climate. We have really strong headwinds. How you doing?
Yeah, of course, we're just coming off of this peak that happens every year where the world's attention is on climate change because we've got this big UN climate conference happening. And I was actually reflecting before we hopped on to do our pod, Catherine, that this was the 10-year anniversary of us meeting each other because it's the 10-year anniversary of the Paris Agreement. And we first met each other in Paris at COP21 when that agreement was being developed and you were playing an active role as a fresh new minister of environment for
What
Canada.
A time. What a time.
Yeah. And so here we are. We went into Brazil, COP30, the 10th anniversary of the Paris Agreement. And all of the big questions were is this thing even working, right? Are we, Trump has been kind of weaponized by the fossil fuel industry to go around bullying world leaders to stop their climate action and buy more fossil fuels. There's, these kind of shifting geopolitics. Emissions are still high. The transition away from fossil fuels is lagging. Is this process delivering what it needs to be delivering? And expectations were pretty high, I would say, for the outcomes in Brazil. It's the case that every COP has a mixed bag of outcomes, right? Every time we go to these UN climate talks, there's a lot on the agenda, and we don't always get all of the wins that we want. I think this year in particular, there were some major milestones that we were hoping to see that didn't get delivered on. That being said, we did get a very strong indication that 195 countries, that's the amount of countries that signed on to the Paris Agreement, minus one, which is the US, who have pulled out of the Paris Agreement under the Trump administration. 195 minus one is 194. It's not zero. All the other countries of the world remain committed to working together on this issue. And there were at least some very strong outcomes that happened in Brazil to reaffirm that collective commitment to cooperating to tackle the climate crisis.
And I think, I think about this a lot. Well, first of all, I think a lot about 10 years ago when I looked a lot younger and felt
Honestly,
a lot younger.
I think you are looking the same pretty much. So,
it's Mutual Admiration Society on this show. But, it was a different time, but a lot, there has been a lot of progress that has happened. I think it's easy to say, oh, the Paris Agreement doesn't matter. Who cares? That's over. And the reality is it's hung together and it's created a framework with all these different, pieces moving forward. And that is critically important. And of course, multilateralism itself is under strain in all sorts of different ways. And so we're seeing that certainly play out in the international climate process. But it can be discouraging. And I just want to ask, because you're really good at talking to people like real people talk. And so I think a lot of people that I talk to who don't really, they aren't part of the climate negotiations. And sometimes I think people, when we get part of it, we're really inside baseball. We're like, will this little thing happen? And it's not a little thing. It could be a big thing, but to the rest of the world, it may not sound like something real. Like if you're trying to talk to regular people, maybe about this particular COP, but just in general, like, why does it matter that
Hmm.
we have these meetings? And is it absurd that everyone traipses around the world to have these discussions?
Yeah, that's always the question, right? What again, it's back to the is this thing worth it? What's the point? And to that, I have a few answers. One, as I said at the top of our conversation, this is a moment every year where for 2 weeks, the global eye is on the issue of climate change. And that's significant because much of the world spends a lot of the rest of the year, um, either being completely snowed under by dis and misinformation that's telling them climate change isn't real, it's not really happening, don't pay attention to it, or they're preoccupied with other really significant issues. I think we're all really sensitive to the layers and layers of crisis that many countries are dealing with, including the crises of climate impacts and impacts from other environmental issues like biodiversity loss. And so, amidst this kind of um, strained environment in terms of political attention, it's very important to have this moment where that political attention is kind of harnessed and directed toward climate. What I've said in the past is that every year we have this process that holds up a mirror to countries to show them what they're doing on climate change, to show what that reflection looks like. And that in and of itself, just as a kind of accountability function, is really significant. That all the countries of the world come together, and share, so those are two reasons that are really important, that
Yeah.
this process is really important. A third is every country in the world is coming together and has an equal seat at the table. And I can't think of another process where that is the case, right? Where, yes, we still see unequal power dynamics play out at the COP, and that's actually the source of so much of the tensions at the COP. But every country has the same platform, every country has a vote. And that means that the power of this process to send a signal out into the rest of the world is really significant. When you've got every country in the world saying the same thing, that sends a significant signal to global markets. That sends a significant signal to investors. And I think it's that signal sending power that you're talking about when you mention the progress that's been made in the last 10 years since the signing of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement was able to send this powerful signal into global markets. Okay, we're transitioning. And we have now, I think many of us are celebrating that we've kind of reached this tipping point where the momentum in those global markets toward clean energy, toward clean technology is unstoppable, even though we are seeing many politicians and many um, lobbyists from specific private sector interests working to try and stop or stall that momentum. It's really unstoppable at this point, right? We're in that renewable energy revolution. It's undeniable. And then, maybe the other thing I'll say is that every country in the world has a climate plan because of the Paris Agreement. I'm pretty
Yeah.
sure Canada would not have a climate plan if it weren't for the Paris Agreement. Um, and, whether we're implementing those climate plans is a part of the discussion. And what does this process have to do with what actually then happens when you hit the ground at home? And how do we make use of the international sphere to apply that pressure back into countries? That's the conversation that we're having now, because clearly, while there has been some progress, it's not going fast enough. Countries aren't delivering what they need to be delivering. And so how we kind of balance okay, here's the progress that's being made, here's what this process does, and here's the homework it gives us for what we need to
Yeah.
be doing when we hit the ground back at home. I think that's what I'm thinking of now that I'm digesting this most recent set of UN climate talks.
Well, it's interesting to think back because you were really helpful to me, by the way, 10 years ago. People are really generous because I actually was just a new minister and I cared a lot about climate change, but I was by no means an expert. And you need to be an expert, right? Like, if to really understand, to build a climate plan, like there's just so many angles. As I say, climate is a thing, it's an everything thing. So you got to, think about so many different issues. And in the context of COP, that's also development, international development. That
Yeah,
is a major issue. And so I do think it is true. Like, Canada wouldn't have a serious climate plan, whether it delivers on it and what elements remain, and approaches. That is a challenge here for sure. And I think it's a challenge in many other countries. But I think that it required people to have some diligence in doing the work, and now they got to implement. I think it's also really important to emphasize what you said, is that everyone has a voice, because it's easy to say, well, why would we come to this place? But if I think back, even the Paris Agreement, where you had the
mm-hmm.
Marshall Islands that would be underwater at 1.5 degrees, and all these countries that are facing devastating impacts, they wouldn't have a voice. Like, that's just the reality, because the big players don't care
Totally.
necessarily, and they don't have to have a discussion about how much money they're going to be doing to support these countries. They don't have to hear the stories that, I love it often when you have the representatives from, often the small island developing states, or you know some of the developing countries the most impacted. Like, they talk in real terms about what is happening, so people have to listen to how many people are dying, about the actual impacts of climate change, the future impacts, having young people explain it. So you wouldn't have that. And I think that is extremely important. I know this year there was a focus on Indigenous peoples. Um, did that? I actually am interested. What's the readout on how well Indigenous peoples were incorporated in the COP? Because that we did have two Indigenous leaders on the show, two awesome women,
Mm-hmm.
Val Courtois and Hindu Umaru Ibrahim, who talked about different perspectives on climate and nature from an Indigenous perspective. But did it work? Was it finally an opportunity to really have Indigenous voices represented and listened to?
Yeah, those were great interviews. And I have to say, just on the note of, countries having a seat at the table, it is those small island developing states. It is some of those countries that are most impacted by climate change. I mean, now we're all feeling those impacts, right? We don't want to say that Canada's not feeling those impacts when our country's basically on fire every summer, but we see that their voices are incredibly powerful and can make a big difference in the COP space, and getting that commitment to, for countries to strive to limit warming to 1.5 degrees was a direct result of their leadership,
Yeah.
and was supported by countries like Canada under your leadership coming in to say, yes, we actually support including this 1.5 limit. And that 1.5 limit has totally changed the game. And anyway, there's now conversations about, okay, are we overshooting it, et cetera? And maybe that's something we want to touch on. But to your question around Indigenous engagement, so here we were in Brazil. The last few COPs have been hosted in countries that weren't as friendly, let's say, to civil society engagement. So we did not see the kind of presence.
Understatement.
Understatement. I'm being very tactful.
Yeah.
So we did not see the presence of civil society, of stakeholder rights holder groups in the ways that we were kind of used to at other UN climate talks. And that was reversed this year. And I think a lot of people felt relief in that, right? That we were able to have a protest on the middle weekend outside, through the roads of Belém, which was the city in northern Brazil where the COP was hosted. And there was an incredible presence of Indigenous people and communities at the COP. A lot of their presence was outside of the COP. We did see Indigenous people as delegates inside the COP, but there were actually protests that characterized the first week of the COP from an Indigenous delegation of Amazonian peoples who came down on a flotilla through the Amazon over days, and their journey to the COP was covered. And when they got to the COP venue, they protested. They were able to actually get into the COP venue to, really force their voice being heard. They locked us out of the COP venue for a while, which I actually felt like grateful to finally be in a place where Indigenous peoples were locking me out of the COP. So I think we did hear their voices, and that was represented in a couple of ways, both kind of outside the formal outcomes of the COP itself, in that Brazil acknowledged 11 indigenous territories in the Amazon and demarcated those territories. And that was one of the major demands that the indigenous peoples who came on that flotilla were making. And that was, that's another part of the function of the COP, is that it can sometimes be used as a vehicle to apply pressure on the host country for delivering on particular promises that they've made. And then in the formal negotiations, one of the outcomes that people are celebrating is an outcome around just transition. And in that just transition, we see some of the strongest language around human rights that we've ever seen in a COP decision. And that includes enshrining the rights of Indigenous peoples to free, prior, and informed consent, which is one of the fundamental principles of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And we've never seen what's, handily called FPIC being mentioned in a text from COP before. So there were, I think, some significant outcomes from the really strong leadership that we saw from Indigenous communities in Belém.
Well, that makes me happy because, I mean, it is about time. And as you say, it's still often outside the COP, not inside the COP. So there is, of course, a lot of work to be done there, but also, I would say, in countries around the world to actually work with Indigenous peoples, recognize that they have solutions and Indigenous traditional knowledge, and they have rights. Okay, so let's take a little bit of a break in that working on climate is super exhausting. Certainly since you spent a lot of time in Brazil, you're just getting back home. So what do you do to take a break? I mean, I've said this many times. I am a swimmer. When I am absolutely exhausted, actually, it gives me energy to go swimming, just to put my head down and sometimes to sing a song in my head. It might be Chapel Roan or something, or it may be I'm trying to solve a problem, or maybe nothing. It may just be zoning out. What do you do?
I go dancing. I love to go dancing. And I actually find that the climate community loves to party. And there were some great parties in Brazil, which was another really fun thing to get back to that we were kind of missing over the last few years. So yeah,
that is awesome. I certainly missed that part.
I'm sad you missed us at the party.
What kind of dancing? Is it like, are we talking like Brazilian type dancing, or is it just dancing?
Well, there was one of the parties where carimbo, which is a dance that's very popular in the region that the COP happened in. And it's like, actually the music itself of the region is fairly chill feeling, but the dance is like, like very quick movement and so impressive to watch. And I really appreciated, I got a little bit of a lesson. My partner told me I was great, but I think it might have just been
I bet you were great. I would be absolutely, I've had 2 left feet, but I wouldn't care. I'd still dance. But that's so great. You know what? That makes me happy because I think we also need to find joy.
Definitely.
It is very important to find joy, even when things are really hard. And so I'm very happy. So anyone that was at COP dancing, I think that is great. And Kat, House of Targ, I've probably talked to you about House of Targ here in Ottawa.
Dancing there. We're due for a dancing time there.
We're due for a dancing session. We'll do it.
Yeah, you have to do these life-affirming things, right? When you work in a field that can cause pretty regular existential crises. So
it's totally true.
Yeah, I think that these moments, like where you're in touch with your body, like swimming is like that as well, where you feel in touch with the world and the people around you. Those are the diversions that really help me restore.
I think also, I was just thinking about dancing because there's so many people from around the world, also local communities, like it's something that people can do, and you might not be able to speak the same language.
Transcends language, totally.
It is that just was okay. Now I feel happier for everyone because I think it was a long and hard COP, as you mentioned. Okay, so we're coming to our last section here, and it's about the future.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, the long term future, we tackle climate change. We stay, within 1.5 degrees. But I'm talking about the future, like next year. And what's on the horizon? What do you see? You're someone who does a lot of deep thinking. On where are the opportunities for climate action. You may need a bit of a breather. I feel like I need a bit of a breather at the end of this year to really reflect on this year. But where are you seeing some opportunities, and where are you going to be spending your time?
Yeah, maybe I'll focus on four areas. Okay, so one is around how we define climate ambition. We've now gone through a couple of years where average global temperatures are hovering around 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So there's a lot of speculation that we've been hearing of like, is this 1.5 degree threshold already past us? And we had some very helpful analysis that was released around the COP this year that told us, despite the fact that we have had these years where we have seen that 1.5 degrees threshold being kind of reached, that doesn't mean that we let go of the 1.5 degree marker as our litmus test for climate ambition. In fact, that 1.5 degree marker is more important than ever because it helps us understand, okay, what we have to claw back to. And it helps us understand the importance of defending against every zero point 0.1 degree of warming. Every zero point 0.1 degree of global warming has huge impacts for natural ecosystems, for human communities, our ability to sustain our societies. Um, and so I think that as we go into the next year, there will be a lot of work being done for us to kind of shift how we talk about that litmus test for ambition, about it being to avoid every zero point 0.1 degree of warming, to make sure that we are doing everything we can to limit the duration and the extent of any overshoot of that 1.5 degrees. And that will include having some tricky conversations about new technologies. We've got a lot of economic interests waiting in the wings to either tell us to give up on our climate ambition because we're not going to meet it and we should just carry on with business as usual, or to tell us we're not going to meet our climate targets, therefore we need to geoengineer our planet. And safeguarding against those interests while very carefully charting our next steps is going to be on the plate for us next year in a major way. So that's one. Two, one of the things that we didn't get the outcomes on this year at this COP that we needed to was around adaptation. And I know that you were a part of starting the thinking on Canada's first national adaptation plan. This year, all the countries' national adaptations plans were due. We had, I'm not sure what the final number is, but it might be something like 40. So it's a low number. There was a global goal in adaptation that was meant to be decided this year. So a big international goal around adaptation. We didn't quite get that delivered in the way we were expecting. There were some promises around increasing finance for adaptation, but they're too far into the future and it's not enough money. So we are now all struggling every day in every place in the world with the impacts of climate change. And we are going to need to figure out both how to raise the political attention to those impacts and the need to adapt, as well as to figure out how to mobilize those resources that countries need to use to do those adaptation efforts. Four is around
Wait, is that
powers.
two? Is that
Or
did I miss
yes, two.
two?
Sorry, I skipped ahead to
I think
four.
you're on three.
I'm on
See,
three.
I'm really
You're
paying
so
hard
good. Thank
attention.
you. Okay, number
I'm
three.
writing notes.
So yeah, we had this reaffirmation of countries' buy-in to climate multilateralism, I would say, over the course of the last year. It's not just about COP. There have been many venues where many countries, I would say actually the G20 this year was yet another one where South Africa was able to actually push through some very ambitious language on climate and energy into the G20 outcome with the other members of the G20, despite a lot of obstructionism from the United States. So we've been seeing that pushback from countries against that obstructionism. And I think it's actually contributing to some really interesting changes in the power dynamics, both around climate, but also around geopolitics in general. And one of those, if we can maybe characterize one of those changes, it's the cooperation that we're seeing between countries in the global majority or the global south or the developing world, many synonyms for this part of the world, not all of them satisfactory. But the power of that cooperation is really rising. One of the places I went to this year that gave me the most hope was the Africa Climate Summit, where representatives
Mm.
from every African country came together to talk about working on climate change. So I think the power dynamics are really shifting, and watching that, paying attention to that, learning that is going to be a major theme for the next year. And then finally, there is this necessary question of, okay, well, how do we actually make the implementation happen on the ground as it needs to be? And there's two dynamics there. One, it's easy if we're Canadian, those of us who are in Canada, we get a bit like um, tunnel visioned with the US perspective. But there is so much happening in the rest of the world that we don't hear a lot about. And I'm definitely doing a lot of thinking about how we increase the insight into what's happening in other parts of the world into Canada to help drive the understanding that the further we draw back on climate ambition, the longer we delay investing in the green economy in this country, the more we're going to set ourselves back in terms of our future prosperity. And so that's maybe a Canadian dynamic to name, pardon me. But I think the broader question of where do we as a climate community need to be really doubling down to make sure that the implementation is happening where it needs to, and that is on the ground in country. And a lot of it will be tied to, as you said earlier, development and finance, and how we change the rules of what success in those worlds look like so that we can actually deliver on climate safety.
I just love it. That's now my agenda. All those four areas are I mean, they're diverse, but they are incredibly important. So thank you for actually stepping back. And I think, yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say about here in Canada, but I think you're right. Like I often hear people, they're so obsessed. We're so obsessed with the United States. Like we always want to not be obsessed with the United States, but it seems to be our only point of reference. And we think, oh, well, I guess everyone's just becoming a petro state, so let's, they can, and let's just do that. And it's interesting because even the US isn't a monolith. I think people don't hear enough
Mm-hmm.
about California or the cities and regions that are acting on climate. So we need to do that. And then just the energy transition, because I think people maybe don't believe it's real. But if you go anywhere in the world, by the way, you're going to have most places, you're going to have an electric vehicle now.
Yep.
Like 1 in 4 new vehicles is electric. And so if you're getting an Uber driver or you're renting a taxi, they're doing it because it's cheaper and it's better technology. And I just worry that, yeah, we're certainly not reducing the emissions and line with our Paris Agreement commitments, but we're also just losing out. Like I wrote
Yes,
this report,
exactly.
winning the future. What is winning the future is? Well, first of all, it's dealing with the risks and the costs that we got right now. So being rational about we need to act. And then two, it's actually investing in the future, not the past, and not getting sucked into discussions by fossil fuel companies that are fake. But anyway, there's a lot to say on that front. But I assume it's not just Canada where we're seeing this because we're seeing, backtracking in other places. But um, this podcast is called Women Leading on Climate, and people ask me, it's a bit like my book Run Like a Girl. Like, why did you call it that? And it's never like it's not. Yes, I am a girl, but it's like do things your own way. But Women Leading on Climate isn't just because like women are half the population. It's because women are leading on climate,
Yeah.
and I think that's a really important point to make. So maybe I know you've thought about this, like, and that this idea that women are playing an important role. And by the way, we all know we're not the CEOs in majority of places, and we're not the leaders. But women are making a difference and are leading the way. Of course, women are disproportionately impacted, but they're finding the solution. So I don't know, like what inspire, a lot of however you identify, you're here because, you're kind of interested in this idea that women are leading. So tell me about your take on this, Kat. You've been in climate world for a really long time.
Yeah, it might be the case that the like structural patriarchy of many of our societies means that women are not in the leadership positions of many private sector and public sector organizations. However, women are thought leaders everywhere. And I see the thought leadership of women characterizing the work in climate everywhere I look. And I see women's leadership, hands on work from women, making a difference everywhere I go. My entire team is made of women. And I would say at least 70% of the people that I interact with in the work that I do are women. We are the powerhouses of change. And I think a big part of that power comes from the facility that we have in building relationships and in our ability to convene. Um, Climate change is a collective problem that requires a collective solution, which is a saying that many of us who work on climate change have heard many times. And therefore, it requires people to be working on it who are very good in bringing people together to come up with those collective solutions. And I think women are disproportionately effective in bringing together groups of people to make change happen. And that's what's needed on climate. So I see women's leadership everywhere I look, whether it's the ideas that are characterizing the needs that we have, the ambition that we need to be seeking, or whether it's the people doing the hands-on work on the ground, bringing together the communities, the coalitions, the networks of actors who need to be working across theories of change, across different sectors to make this change happen, to make these ideas a reality. Women are on the forefront of all of that. And also women are just really fun and bringing the fashion to all of the climate spaces. And I think that's
I just got
important.
my earrings.
Yeah.
I like my earrings. Kat is always very well attired. She's got you got the fashion.
Yeah, women and queer people are livening up the spaces, and that's important too, because our revolution must be beautiful.
I love that so much. Well, thanks for that. I mean, that is, you really capture it. And for women who are listening to this, or young women, and you're thinking about how do you make a difference. I mean, it's about talking to people. Part of that, like you're not going to start and be Cat Abreu, like convening people globally. But it's by starting in your communities, and that's what we see all the time. Like it can be talking in your book club. Like I know this theory of change is we need to get more women talking and saying they're talking to tell people when they're like, often men, oh, no one cares about climate change in their polls, which are like, would you like climate action or would you like a job? And obviously that polling is bonkers. But I do think that women are often doing the work, are amazing at convening and building the relationships you need, and they're bringing the fashion. Okay, so that's a good way to end this podcast. But the very end, what I always say is imagine we're hanging out, having a drink. It's been, a long day and we're just having a good time. What song would you want me to play at the top of my playlist?
Okay, I do love music and I love dancing, as I said, but I brought a poem, actually. I would be the person at the party being like, hey, can we take a moment to read some poetry? That's
awesome. Okay.
If you're up for it. I brought a poem from the one and only Oracle Margaret Atwood, who I had a chance to meet last year, and I've always been really inspired by this poem that she wrote called The Moment. Can I read it for you?
You can totally read it. Okay. Awesome.
The moment when, after many years of hard work and a long voyage, you stand in the center of your room, house, half acre, square mile, island, country, knowing at last how you got there, and say, I own this, is the same moment the trees unloose their soft arms from around you. The birds take back their language. The cliffs fissure and collapse. The air moves back from you like a wave, and you can't breathe. No, they whisper, you own nothing. You were a visitor time after time, climbing the hill, planting the flag, proclaiming. We never belonged to you. You never found us. It was always the other way around.
Wow. Well, what a way to end the first season, I hope, of the Women Leading on Climate podcast with an amazing Canadian writer and leader, and also with you, Kat.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's hard not to get emotional because it feels like it's been a long year, and it's hard. But we will keep on keeping on, and we will also doing it looking fashionable and dancing.
Yeah,
and sometimes you gotta cry.
Sometimes you gotta cry, and that's also a really efficient way to deal with the emotion. Yeah. Thanks so much, Catherine.
Well, thank you. You're the best, Kat. Thanks for everything, and just everyone. We're just gonna keep on keeping on. Well, that's a wrap. What a great first season of the Women Leading on Climate podcast. Many thanks to the McConnell Foundation and the Canadian chapter of Women Leading on Climate for supporting this series. Also, a huge thanks to the incredible women climate leaders who inspired us this season. The show was produced by Katie McGuire and edited by Mark Pinillo. I'm your host, Catherine McKenna. Until next time, let's keep each other motivated, and yes, let's keep on pushing on climate.